He was listed on the Arabian Business Power List as one of the planet's 100 most influential young Arabs. He's worked for the HuffPost Live, Al Jazeera, the New York Times, and the BBC, amongst others. So, welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you. Hi. Because facts matter and we live in a post-fact era, I was not an Emmy, or I am not an Emmy Award winner. I am a nominee, but anyway. I was going to let it slide, but then my sister would hold me accountable, as she should. So I'm Ahmed Shihab Eldin. I tell stories for a living, and I'm trying to redesign how journalism works today. So there I am, Palestinian by blood, American by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, Austrian by adolescence, Kuwaiti by family refuge, curious by nature. And if you'd met me on Twitter, this is how you would have met me. And I believe that the more transparent and accountable I can be as a journalist about my identity and my experiences, the more compelling, the more credible I am. If you would have met me 6 years ago in 2012 at South by Southwest, you would have watched as I indulged my inner child, which I would encourage you all to do often. Or you would have also watched as a man basically attacked me on a panel about the Arab uprisings and social media and said, "You're not a journalist, you're an activist," as if the two are mutually exclusive. Now, considering how many things I've been called in my life, I figured, it's really interesting to be called an activist because he intended it to be an insult, but it was a compliment, something I take pride in, quite frankly. Why wouldn't I? Here is the dictionary's definition of activist: a person who campaigns to bring about social or political change. So then if we define the verb campaign, work in an organized and active way towards a goal. So then I definitely am an activist. In fact, I would argue that all journalists, including the so-called objective ones, are activists. Now, I've spent more than a decade telling stories, often from the kind of darkest corners of the world, if you will. And oftentimes what I actively try to do is humanize people. To not just share their story, but to connect their story through me with the stories of all of you. I don't know what that was. It was like some sort of thing. I'm just going to go with it. So, what I do is I try to reveal truths. I try to expose abuses of power. I try to promote understanding through providing context. I try to ultimately, like design, which I'm learning things about, I try to constructively find solutions to problems. Now, especially in this era of fake news where facts don't matter, journalism must be designed with stories in mind. And that includes my story and any other reporter's story. Now, my identity and my experiences inform my approach to reporting. To me, they're inextricably linked. In 2011, as the Arab world erupted in revolution, the media was going through social media revolution as well, I was developing a show called The Stream for Al Jazeera English. It was supposed to tap into the kind of extraordinary potential and power of social media to disseminate the news in a different way, to level the playing field. Now, back then, on stages similar to this one, less yellow though, I would often say at a Google conference, for example, that the democratization of media is directly related to the democratization of the Arab world, something that had seemed so elusive, especially for the younger generation. Now, this is a quick reminder why. But tweets continued to spread, documenting a society's breakdown.
The internet is reportedly cut off from Sidi
People are creating barricades to protect their neighborhood.
Students demonstrating in Klubia, 50 miles
Injured young man shot by police in his back in Kafsa.
For a full week, I watched the story unfold online, speaking to activists, using Facebook and Twitter as protests turned bloody. And on January 12th, with Ben Ali's regime on the verge of collapse, Time magazine finally found the story. But the social networks had the best coverage. A new power structure had emerged. So in the past, journalists were the gatekeepers of information. The public would rely on a handful of authoritative figures who were supposedly objective, and it's worth pointing out that they were almost always white men. You see, the guise of objectivity tends to serve the interests of the most privileged among us, especially in the status quo. They would select the stories that they determined were worth sharing. Now, with the rise of information technology and social media access, oh, those are the men, just in case you were wondering. That reality has really changed, and with it, I would argue, so has what makes a storyteller credible or a story compelling. People tell me all the time, for example, I love your work because you're so authentic, you're so credible because I believe you, because you also post, selfies and weird things. Something my sister, by the way, who Now I'm digressing, but the point is, she sometimes says this discredits you as a journalist when you post a selfie and your tongue's hanging out, it's clear that you've maybe had a drink or 75. But I think that does kind of make me more relatable. And this is what I can tell you, I was always kind of confused growing up. I grew up moving around a lot, so I always kind of felt like an outcast. In the Arab world, I felt extremely Western. And in the US and Europe, where I went to high school, I'd always feel super Arab, or at least aware of how Arab I was. Then there was this phase, which is something I'm not going to get into. But the point is, this schizophrenic existence not only led to this photo, but the conflicting kind of experiences that I lived shaped who I was and shaped the way I would tell stories. Now, I moved to, although I was born in the US, I didn't really live there till I was 17. I moved to Boston. It was the year after 9/11. Not the best time to be named Ahmed. One of the many names of the Prophet, by the way, and the last name of Shihab Eldin, which translates to the shooting rocket or comet of religion. So that's my name. That's the kind of rough translation. Blessed prophet shooting rocket of religion. And just quickly, side note, I know I'm going to regret this because I'm eating into my time, but my initials are actually ARSE, which spells. So my parents wanted to set me up for a life of challenge, I guess. But by then I had, in all seriousness, I had endured a form of racism that was in its ugliest forms when I moved from the chaos and dysfunction of Egypt to the order and the discipline of Austria. It was 1999, and I was 14, the same year that Jörg Haider, a neo-Nazi, was gaining popularity. Now, my culture and my heritage was being vilified. It was being demonized, and whether intentionally or not, the media played a critical role, as did politicians, not just in the US, but around the world. So as a young man, trying to figure out, what we all struggle with in our youth. Who am I? What should I do? How the world really works, what your role is in the world. I was constantly made aware of how much misinformation and prejudice there was about my identity, who I was. I was also aware of the media's kind of critical role in perpetuating these stereotypes and misrepresentations as a product of how it was designed, how it functioned, what we expect from it, what we expect from ourselves as storytellers. That's why social media was so exciting to me. All of a sudden, I had access to tons of people all over the world who were sharing stories, their own snippets, they were sharing commonality, they were disrupting this kind of conventional way in which news functions, this view from nowhere, this passive experience with these so-called authoritative voices. So with the rise of social media, it became crystal clear to me that my identity was and would always be inextricably linked to my career as a journalist. The truth is, in journalism, what your name is, where you're from, what languages you speak, what you've witnessed, it all factors in. I knew that in one way or another, part of my storytelling would be to try and correct some of the misconceptions and the misrepresentation, not just of my people, but of people who are voiceless, who have suffered for a long time, who are living under oppression, and who can't advocate for themselves. Now, one has to wonder, why does the media continuously give extremists that seek to divide, whether President Donald Trump or ISIS, a platform to define an entire population, to frame civilization as us versus them? What about love, as we heard this morning? Why is the media currently designed to do this? Why is it telling stories that are motivated by fear? As if there are only two sides to any story. And one of my biggest frustrations was how the media often lacks depth. It trades in depth, nuance, and context for speed, a short attention span, and let's make it really simple. So let's take something simple and straightforward in terms of how it's designed, like a headline. That's not a headline. That's a headline. Well, it's a headline in a tweet. As the carnage was playing out in the past few weeks in Gaza, the New York Times put this out. Dozens of Palestinians have died in protests as the US prepares to open its Jerusalem embassy. Now, in storytelling 101, passive voice in general is not a strong form of writing. So why are they doing it here? What is this designed to do? This passive voice. Judd Apatow, a Jewish director, highlighted the problem candidly. Have died? Shame on you. This is like calling Trump's lies factual inaccuracies. Please tell me an intern is running your Twitter feed. Well, as someone who's worked at the New York Times, I can definitely tell you an intern is not running their Twitter feed, but many of the writers who cover this conflict at the New York Times have children who fight in the army, in the Israeli army, that had just slaughtered more than 60 Palestinians and injured thousands more. But you know, the New York Times is considered objective. Never mind, you know, that fact I just mentioned or that headline. And this is the Washington Post's headline. Gaza buries its dead as death toll from protests at fence with Israel rises to at least 60. Again, we're left wondering, did the protests kill the protesters? Did they just drop dead? In fact, it seems to be in line with the US government's official response. Trump administration exclusively blames Hamas after Israeli soldiers killed dozens of Palestinians. Exclusively blames Hamas. I mean, it's ridiculous, some of you are laughing, but this is my reality and this is the reality of my people. How about the Wall Street Journal? Clashes over new embassy in Jerusalem leave dozens dead. I mean, George Orwell wrote 70 years ago that the modern political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable. And this is when I really realized it. That the language is designed to rob the oppressed of their humanity. And the worst part about it, you know, this is not anything new, but this story, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, has long suffered these unintended consequences, or unfortunate, maybe they are intended, of adhering to objectivity, this idea that, you know, I can be impartial, you know, which allows for false equivalencies that then censors and suppresses the truth on the ground. I mean, I've seen this happen not just with Palestine and Israel, but time and time again. And I've spent a decade working in the US media, so I've witnessed the censorship, and I've struggled with it. At Vice, where I worked, an entire scene where a family was being evicted from, by settlers who were there. It was such this powerful scene. It was raining. It was the kind of thing that if I was making a film, I couldn't have created. And you know, this was part of the reason why I quit Vice, because of the censorship, this idea that, oh, we have to be objective. We have to equalize this extremely disproportionate story and conflict. And even though the recent coverage of the Gaza massacre, again, focused entirely on Hamas's violent takeover, armed resistance, I mean, thousands of people were shot, very little mention. Let's focus on Hamas and the danger and equalizing Hamas to Israel. Now, in the spirit of time, I'm going to skip over a few things, but I do want to quickly mention that the rise of social media has also let people like Sarah Silverman, Andrea Mitchell, and even Natalie Portman, all famous Jewish American women with millions and millions of followers on their publishing platforms, to challenge the conventional narrative, to challenge this idea of equalizing the two. Moreover, it's also allowed, this is Natalie Portman, and there's Andrea Mitchell's, it's also allowed for the emergence of sympathetic hashtags like Ahed Tamimi, a fair, young-skinned young woman that, for better or worse, because she's white, it helps her humanize these Palestinians. This is a reality. There's also Jarrah, a disabled Palestinian refugee, who also, you know, his story resonates. Why? Because many of you will remember when Trump was kind of mocking the disabled reporters. And then you have this disabled man who's climbing Mount Everest against all the odds. It's inspiring. It humanizes a group of people, again, who are dehumanized. Now, if a majority of climate scientists say climate change is real and requires our immediate attention, but some people think it's not true, should we give both sides equal weight? Why then do we? With Israel and Palestine, or many other similar David and Goliath situations. This is why I focus on telling stories with the purpose of disrupting these conventional norms. It's my job to afflict those who are comfortable and privileged by reporting truths and not shying away from the truths about injustice. If we use the standard of objectivity in journalism, sharing two sides of a story as if it were that simple, right, and apply it to solving conflict, it leaves you wondering how you can do that if you don't even stay in the room to hear the other side, who is the representative of those who have just been killed. Now, this is something I would post on Instagram, and you know, I get attacked. People say, you're not a journalist, why are you posting this picture? Well, why did she walk out? I think it's newsworthy, isn't it? I don't understand passive journalism. I'm not quite sure what it is, whether it's in the New York Times headlines or the general approach to storytelling. This is why I'm unapologetic about trying to expose facts and injustices as they are experienced by the people on the ground. You know, in my opinion, objectivity as an ethos in journalism has become about, you know, focusing on what journalists should not be, rather than what we should be. We're out of time. I'm going to speed through this. This is what happens when you tell jokes. There is nothing, I will say very quickly, more humbling for me than to feel other people's struggles and listen to their experiences. It contextualizes my own experience. It promotes empathy and inclusion. Journalists have the ability, the imperative responsibility to change society for the better. Now, it's time, I think, for all of us, not just journalists, all of us are storytellers, right, to be more honest and self-aware of our own identity and how that factors into not just how we connect, but how we tell stories. Now, I'm going to see if I can quickly slide through all these things. Okay, truth, transparency, and accountability. I'm going to leave you with this. These are the tenets of a journalistic redesign. The most powerful stories I've told, and the ones that I'm most proud of, are the ones where I've used my authentic voice. These are the stories that end up changing people's lives. And I plan to continue using my voice and encourage you to use your own. And because it's quite hot, I don't usually end my speeches with stripping, but I'm sorry for if anyone has to censor this. But I want you to use your voice because our voice is really the only thing that will protect us. So.
Fight the power! Fight the power!